to Philosophy of Everything. I'm Susan Reese. Let's talk about set theory. Let's talk about set theory because it helps us understand the limits of reason and, more importantly, the paradoxical nature of reality and your own little strange sense of self. So what is set theory? Set theory comes to us from mathematics, but it's really where math and philosophy collide, and we'll be focusing more on the philosophy side of things. So set theory is really just a way to group data together and to use this specific framework to apply that universally. So by sets, you can also think of it as groups or bundles or wholes. So however it makes it easier for you to understand, but you're essentially just putting groups of data together based off of specific criteria. So set theory isn't quite considered group theory in math, but it still has some of the same benefits in terms of helping us being able to understand the wholes and the parts. So from this lens of trying to understand the coherence of the whole, whether the whole is the universe, the culture, or your psyche, it has a lot of importance for us here. So there are 11 rules of set theory, and the rules just mean it's really what creates a framework. So how can we apply this universally? And the 11th rule in particular, so the last rule, is where things get interesting. The 11th rule of set theory says that the set can be within itself, or said differently, the whole can be within the whole itself. So the other rules of set theory, or the idea of set theory at large, imply that this can indeed be the case. There's no particular rule or particular information that would say that you cannot have the set within itself. And if anything, set theory actually implies that anything can be within a set. So that would mean, of course, the 11th rule of set theory can apply. Well, in the early 1900s, a mathematician, Bertrand Russell, realized some peculiar phenomenon happens when you try to see the 11th rule of set theory through. He realized it creates a paradox. This is now known as Russell's paradox. So let's look at an example of set theory and the 11th rule and see what this paradox is exactly. So a famous example of set theory that, if you're familiar with set theory, you've probably heard of, is called the barber's dilemma. So in the barber's dilemma, the set is defined as the barber who shaves those and only those men who do not shave themselves. So that is the definition of the set itself. So the entire whole is that. So if we follow now the 11th rule of set theory and we put the set within itself, we now have the barber who shaves those and only those men who do not shave themselves within the set that is the barber who shaves those and only those men who do not shave themselves. But when we have this and we now try to see, is the barber shaving himself or not, we realize we're running into some contradictions that don't make any logical sense. So if the barber is in the set, and he is in the set because the 11th rule of set theory says we can do that, but if he's in there, then that means he shaves those and only those who do not shave themselves. So to be in the set, he cannot shave himself because he wouldn't meet the larger criteria of the set itself. But he has to be in there because he's also the entire set himself. He is the criteria of the set. So if you continue to try to walk through this yourself, you can see the paradox this is creating. It creates a paradox because it has contradictions. There's polarities, there's things that do not make reasonable sense. So this is why a paradox cannot rely on reason or logic. And we are seeing that here in the 11th rule of set theory. Now, importantly, set theory itself actually functions as a great metaphor for the reason versus revelation duality. So reason is rules 1 through 10. So the bulk of the rules, the bulk of the framework do indeed rely on reason, on analysis, on logic, on your intellectual brain. Only one of the rules doesn't, but it's that final rule, that one rule that relies on something far greater than your intellect and gives you and offers you a whole lot more. It helps you understand the larger picture, the bigger picture, the whole. So it helps us understand that the bulk of our understanding is going to be based on reason. Reason functions as the arc, but revelation is what will tie the entire picture together and helps us understand a coherence of the whole. So why am I saying that this is similar to the coherence of the whole? What am I saying here? Because when the set meets itself, importantly, this is the only time the paradox arises. It's only the 11th rule of set theory that gives us this paradox. So it's only when the set meets itself, only when the whole meets itself. So this is a self-referential paradox. When the self tries to reference the self, it results in a paradox. Why? Well, importantly, the set, in the example we walked through, is not just the barber. The set is the barber who shaves those and only those who do not shave themselves. We cannot separate the barber, we cannot separate the whole, the set, from the criteria that define who he is. And when we try to do that, when we try to isolate the set from the parts within the set, the whole from the parts, we cannot do it. The criteria of the whole that is in the whole itself is what makes the whole the whole. The set cannot be defined without understanding the parts within the set. The barber is not the set. It is the barber who shaves those and only those who do not shave themselves. The criteria of the parts within the whole are defining who he is. The whole is dependent on the parts, and the parts is dependent on the whole. Nothing can be defined in isolation. There is no single self. Without an outwards reference point, without a counterpart, there is no self. There is no observation. Think about what it means to be an observer. To be an observer requires you to have an observation. There needs to be something for you to look at. You need to be having an observation, which means there can never just be one. To understand a paradox, to understand the self, requires something beyond reason. Reason, intellectualizing, rationalizing will no longer help you understand the 11th rule of set theory. To understand any paradox requires something beyond reason. To understand the self, because again, that's what the paradox is arising from. It's trying to look at the self, to see the whole, to see the coherence of the whole. What is the self? You need to be able to use something beyond reason. What does it require then for us to understand this? Well, this is what wisdom is all about. It is no longer able to rely on an outwards knowing, an outwards knowledge. You can no longer follow a framework. And that's what an outwards knowledge is. It's following a framework, just like the first 10 rules of set theory. It is an outwards knowing because you can just simply comply with rules. You can learn about it in a textbook. You can follow rules that someone else told you to follow. When it comes to a paradox, when it comes to the whole, when it comes to the self, it requires you to look inwards. That is the only way you can understand it. It is not about articulating something through reason. You have to experience it. It is through contemplation. That is the highest form of knowing, and that's how we walk through, or rather sit with, all of the contradictions, all of the polarities, to let them coexist, to understand the nature of reality, which is a paradox. It is a paradox because the universe is folded within itself. Everything is within itself because nothing is in isolation. Nothing can be defined in isolation. To be given definitions, attributes, to be observed, require there to be someone to observe you. Nothing can be isolated from anything else. This is important from a very individual or microcosmic perspective as well. Think about our psychology. Our sense of self is not defined in isolation from ourselves and the rest of the world. Who we are is defined by the quality of our relationships, the quality of our subjective experiences, the quality of our time. Everything about our relationships with others is really just a reflection of the relationship with ourselves, because otherwise we can't see ourselves. In order to know ourselves is to have experiences with other people, is to engage with the world at large, because this is how we're able to know ourselves. To know ourselves is to participate in the world. To know yourself, to know what your relationship is with yourself, is to know what your attachment style is with other people. This is how we see the self. The self, trying to see the self, will always create a cyclical loop. That is what the self-referential paradox is. It is a cyclical loop, and that is the pattern that repeats in our reality over and over and over again, because it is endlessly the universe asking the question, who am I? It is the universe trying to know itself. But the universe is infinite, so it will never have just one answer. It will have endless cyclical loops. It will have an endless self-referential paradox that is continuously folded within itself, because it will always need a reflection to answer the question, who am I? And that reflection itself will also always need a reflection to answer the question. So it will just continue. It will repeat over and over again, because this is infinity. It is the self-referential paradox. It is the 11th rule of set theory, and it is the nature of both the universe and yourself. Another way to look at this is actually looking at Zen koans. Zen koans come to us from Zen Buddhism. And if you weren't familiar with their purpose or what they are, and you just read a Zen koan, you would think they sound so peculiar, because they do. They're not things that can be rationalized. You can't analyze or intellectualize your way through them. But that's not the point of a Zen koan. The point of a Zen koan is to put your left brain to rest. Or rather, actually, is to use both sides of your brain so you can have a coherence of the whole and understand something far greater than just what's outside of you. It requires you to look inwards. It requires an inner knowing. You can no longer rest on some framework, some rules, some books. It's what's inside of you. What is the self looking at? This is what a Zen koan is trying to get you to do. Alan Watts described the purpose of Zen koans as, quote, going down into one's own inner secret place and asking there for a direct encounter with the world, independent of convention, unquote. So you can see here the same idea. This is the idea of being forced to look inwards, and the paradox does just that. And it's looking inwards that allows you to experience the self, because you can't see it, but you can experience this paradox. And just like any paradox, this is beyond the limits of reason, beyond the limits of intellect. This is why wisdom is the faculty of the heart, because wisdom is always a paradox. The set theory that I started this episode with is actually what's referred to today as naive set theory. Because the set theory that's more common in today's textbooks and classrooms is an updated version of set theory that has been updated to essentially remove the 11th rule of set theory and prevent the paradox. To prevent the paradox, what they have done is they created rules and limitations on what can be in a set, which means it's no longer a set that can contain everything. To understand everything, you need to be able to engage with the paradox. And a paradox is not something intellect can reason itself through. To understand everything is not the faculty of the brain. It is the faculty of wisdom. Wisdom is the faculty of the heart. If you try to navigate any paradox with intellect alone, you just end up chasing your own tail, going in circles, chasing some barber who's randomly shaving people. Don't do that. I hope this was helpful, and I will see you next time. Take care.